In this short presentation, I will be discussing true cognates, describing and exemplifying both identical and semi-cognates and how they can be used to help language learners. So what are cognates? Cognates are words that are the same, nearly the same, or at least recognizably the same in two or more languages, and cognates present an advantage to language learners. A person learning a new word in a target language that contains cognate words with a language that that person already knows is able to make a very good guess at the meaning of many words without ever having seen them before. This can make vocabulary acquisition and overall language comprehension much easier. Cognates can be either identical or semi-cognates. So identical meaning they're the exact same word in two languages spelled the same way, or semi-cognates, also known as near cognates, meaning that they are similar but not exactly the same word. So here's an example for you. Without knowing much Spanish, as an English speaker, you can probably guess the word for antibióticos in English. So it's antibiotics, of course. Antibióticos and antibiotics, while not quite identical, are cognate words in Spanish and English. Can you guess what pasaporte means? Right, passport. What about aceptar? This one is a verb in its infinitive form, which we know by that AR ending there. Did you guess accept? If so, you are correct. Examples of identical cognates in Spanish and English are animal or animal, canal, canal, escape, escape. They're spelled the exact same way, and therefore they are identical cognates. In fact, English and Spanish share many cognates. About a third of the most frequently used words are said to be cognate due to their Latin roots via the influence of French on English, and even some Greek and Germanic roots as well. So this provides us with a lot of help as English speakers learning Spanish or Spanish speakers learning English. And once you get used to looking for these similar words across languages, you can get really good at guessing, which can be a great strategy for learning. And you can become familiar with patterns as well. For example, you'll notice that the ción endings in Spanish equate to chun in English most of the time, like nación and nation. And that nouns ending in ia in Spanish usually appear as y endings in English, like biología and biology. And that words beginning with an S plus a consonant in English, like strategy, will appear with a prefixed E in Spanish, as in estrategia. So basically, if you're not sure of the meaning of a word between Spanish and English, you can take a guess at least a third of the time with some relative accuracy, which is a huge advantage, really, for language learners. And this is the case for English and other Romance languages, too. As I mentioned earlier, French has had a huge influence on English. But it is interesting because English is classified as a Germanic language, but it has demonstrably significant Romance language influence. For example, in French, you have bicyclette in bicycle, histoire in history, problème in problem, and the list goes on. Unfortunately, if you're studying a language that has no linguistically familial connection to the one that you already speak, you can't use this strategy. So for example, the Japanese word for antibiotics is kosebutsu. And so clearly, as a native speaker, you can see that word here. So clearly, as an English speaker, I mean to say, there's nothing in Japanese in this case that would flag you to the fact that this word means antibiotics in English. So vocabulary acquisition will likely come less naturally for those studying a language with little or no crossover. Of course, you always have those international loan words like internet and Coca-Cola, or other brand names like Nike, Apple, Audi, etc., or popular food words like taco, kimchi, pretzel, and so on. But those words won't get you that far in carrying a more in-depth structured conversation. And just actually as an additional side note, Japanese actually has a word for these borrowed international loan words, which is gailaigo, mostly coming from English, but not necessarily. There are words from other languages that have integrated into Spanish as well, into Japanese, as well, which make up this gailaigo group of words. So now you know that cognates are semantically overlapping words with two or more languages, between two more languages that may or may not be identical. To further help you identify cognates, you should know that they are often morphologically the same, meaning they usually come in the same word forms with similar word parts. Using that antibioticos to antibiotics example again, you can see that both words are nouns and carry the same Latin anti prefix, meaning against or opposed to. The suffixes, however, differ slightly with the O missing in the English word. Pragmatically, cognates are also often the same as well, and that means that they are used in the same way under similar circumstances. Pragmatics and usage go together. So antibioticos and antibiotics are basically equal terms in that they can be directly translated and used in a conversation between, for example, a doctor and a patient in either language. And that means to say, in other words, that one is not slang or inappropriate in one language and then formal in the other. They basically fit in the same way, in the same kind of context in either language. Phonologically, however, cognates differ quite significantly almost all of the time, given the way that languages differ in the way they're spoken. This is where cognates can be more challenging to identify, as they may look similar but sound different, given differences of intonation, tone, stress, rhythm, etc. But listening for cognates is also a skill that can be developed. There is usually still enough overlap for that guessing strategy I mentioned earlier to work pretty well with experience. So if you can recall the earlier examples of orthographically identical cognates in Spanish and English, animal, canal, escape, or animal, canal, escape, as seen here, clearly they look the same, but they're pronounced slightly differently. In Spanish, animal carries emphasis on the final syllable, aka palabra aguda or acento agudo, or the acute accent, but in English it's on the first syllable, animal. Canal comes close, as you can see in their phonetically written forms here. Canal in English and canal in Spanish, but they are still not phonetically identical in both languages. And then escape or escape, while carrying the same syllabic emphasis, has a few phonetic differences, but most notably that short A sound in Spanish, the escape, and the long A sound in English, escape. So note that, but also note that in its infinitive form in Spanish, escape diverges slightly as a reflexive verb, escaparse, and note that morphological difference there, but it carries enough similarities in English that even without a lot of context, one might be able to guess its meaning. Escaparse, escapa, escape, sort of sound it out, and you might be able to figure it out. So cognates fall on a spectrum of identical to similar to barely recognizable, having originally come from the same root word, but evolving significantly over time. So there's a range to consider here, but truly it's a subjective matter in many cases. As what one person would deem cognate, another person might not, and that can depend on proficiency level, because as proficiency increases, so does cognate recognition, and that's been shown in research to date. Can you guess, for example, what gato means in English? It's a Spanish word. It actually never occurred to me that it might be cognate between English and Spanish, but a colleague mentioned that to me one time, which I thought was interesting because I'd never made that connection. But gato, cat, gat, I guess, could have come from the same original root and evolved over time to be sort of loosely similar, depending on how you look at it. But remember that cognates don't necessarily work across multiple languages, like the word casa does in Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian. It's the word for house, casa. In that case, it does work across the three languages as the same word and identical in all three cases. But you can imagine a Spanish speaker trying to learn French or vice versa, and them finding gato and gâteau surprisingly not the same, the words for cat and cake, respectively, there. So this pair of false cognates in Spanish and French leads to my next video on false cognates. So check it out if you're interested. And if you have any of your own examples of cognates to share, something funny or interesting perhaps, feel free to share it in the comments below. Thank you.